experience. And then eventually we're going to transfer the risk. And if we don't transfer the risk, then we're going to escalate, right? So the general idea is use that methodology because it's actually leverage. It's using leverage as we go through the process to say to the client, listen to what I'm saying, otherwise this is going to escalate. Now, another piece of leverage you might want to use is acceptance. Now, acceptance is interesting. When a client is asked to accept a solution, what they tend to want to do is they get to the point where they're like, oh, we're testing this forever. They're like, look, can we get this into production, right? And then we'll keep testing it. Now, the problem that we've got with that is that once a solution goes into production, let's actually draw two versions of the solution here. So let's say we have kind of like the test environment and we actually have the live environment. Once the solution goes into live, what happens is that they are getting the commercial value of the solution without paying the commercial price, right? So essentially they haven't paid fully for it yet. They haven't accepted it and they've put this thing into production. But guess what? Who owns the customer's production environment? Not you. You are not responsible for what happens in a customer's live environment. They are, right? No company can ever outsource truly the impact of having to deal with their live customer environment. The responsibility of the customer is to correctly have tested what goes into production. You can't point to a third party and say, oh, Vendavo made me put this stupid system into production. Now, we can validate this by going back through all the case law that exists for all the types of customers that have tried to sue service providers. Now, if you go back and you look at, Wipro versus National Grid, which is the most recent kind of big ticket one that we've had, one of the first things that the judge said is, how did this thing get into production? Not only how did it get into production, why was it still there a year after it went in? Why, National Grid, did you let the penalties for having this stupid thing in production continue to add up? I get it. Accenture might not have done everything correct, but why did you put it into production? And there's no answer for that. So what we want to do is make sure that as we go through this process, the client understands that there is only one migration into production, and that is after they accept the solution. And so you can actually then use acceptance as leverage, right? Hey, once you put this into production, this thing is live and running and you're on the hook for why it got there. I don't think you should do that. I think you should actually be testing this with us, making sure that it's right, making sure that it's to a certain point, right? Now, Chase is sitting there saying, well, that's the opposite thing you told us before to actually push it into production. But remember, we're talking specifically about the configurator in that instance. But what we're saying is be careful about how many times you put or allow your project plan to have a migration into production. There should be one, and it should be at the point where both organizations have done their testing, where both organizations are saying, yes, this is the right strategy, let's get it into production. What we don't want to have happen on a project is that we get into a situation where we've put the solution into production, we're now finding a whole bunch of actual live testing that's creating a lot of concern, and now what we're doing is going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and now what we're doing is just completely killing our margin, right? That's what we're doing when we get stuck into this cycle. So get the customer to accept and put the solution into production, even if what that means is accepting the solution with some imperfections in the configurator or even with some imperfections in some of the functionality that they want to test. The last thing that we can use as a piece of leverage is failure. The sponsors on these projects do not want to fail. Like we talked about in the skill step that we looked at earlier, sometimes there can be no choice about what it is that the customer has to accept because there's no alternatives. So in most instances, if you drive these issues up to the stakeholder and you say to them, look, at the moment, we're either going to do this or this project is going to fail, the customer doesn't want the project to fail. They can't afford to have the project to fail. They have spent $1 million, whether it's directly with you or indirectly, already on each of these projects, right? They've wasted company resources. They've bought a product that they're not using. They've paid you some of your bills. No matter what you look at it, right? They're up to their eyeballs in expended money, and if they get no outcome for it, it's going to be a failure. They can't afford to have that on their careers. So that's something that works in your favor. Now, do we want to walk around telling the client this is going to fail if they don't come to a meeting, right? No, we don't want to be doing that necessarily. But the reason we teach you this stuff is because clients are using leverage against you all the time. They are adept at doing it. Now, the way we look at it is commerce has been happening for like 3,000 years, I think, if you do the math, right? Like, actual kind of exchanging of money for goods and services and so on. So if we think that for 3,000 years this has been occurring, customers have learned how to get the most out of that transaction, while we've been focused on how to give them the most amount of value. We haven't necessarily been focused on the leverage exchange that occurs during the transaction. And especially for a service, that exchange goes over a long period of time. So what we've got to become better at doing is understanding how the leverage occurs between the parties. Now, leverage is selectively applied. These are not natural consequences. These are consequences that you are deciding to apply, much like these are consequences that the customer is deciding to apply. And that's why we call them leverage. Be aware of the leverage that you have. Be prepared to use it with permission from your management team. Don't attempt it on the fly, but remember, the customer is probably trying to leverage you. Now, what does it feel like to be leveraged? Well, it feels like you're being made to do something that you don't want to do. And so if you feel like that, escalate it, right? Go see your manager, go see your project manager, go see your P&L owner, your sponsor. So the general idea is if you feel that way, you're probably being leveraged. And so think about how you might be able to counter that leverage with your own leverage if you can find it. So the general idea is leverage is not really bad. Leverage is just the way the client likes to try and get the most amount of value for the least amount of price. And if we have to protect our P&L and protect the customer from bad decisions, then we're going to have to use leverage to counter it. And that's why we teach it. That's the difficult conversation framework for today. Difficult conversations are the defining moments of projects. We must learn to relish the opportunity to have them because they are an opportunity to earn the customer's trust. If we ignore them, the cost of them gets worse over time. Use the difficult conversation frameworks to build trust by preparing for them well and using the empathy, understanding, resolution model. Use leverage when appropriate, because if you don't, it's very, very possible that the customer is already trying to apply leverage to you. Now, if we look at the skill step for today, what we're going to do is simply just one thing. Go and identify a difficult conversation. If you're a project manager, go identify and have it. But we're not necessarily kind of pushing people into difficult conversations if we don't think that they're ready for them. Now, if you think you are ready for it and your project manager agrees, then sure, sit in on it, watch it, have a conversation. That's perfectly fine if your project manager says that you should. But from our perspective as PS principals, we're just asking you at this point to go and identify a difficult conversation. We don't want you to rush into them. Having the difficult conversation will come further in the program when you've got more skills. But for now, just go identify one, bring it to your project manager, talk about it. Is it really a difficult conversation that the project manager is going to act on? The project manager might agree it's a difficult conversation, but they also might agree that it's not on the important and urgent scale. And that's what we're actually testing out here. What is our ability to apply our difficult conversation kind of radar to our Eisenhower decision matrix? Can you identify a difficult conversation that exists in this portion of the project? That's what we want you to do as a skill step. Go do that and we will see what happens. Put that into the experience log and then you're done. All right, now back to the discussion session. Oh, actually, I'm going forward. Sorry. Back to the discussion session. So the case study. No, we're not going to do that. We're just going to do discussion. Yuvaraj, can you repeat your question for me? Unless anybody has any questions on the content or the skill step.
Sure, Shane. So I'm looking at the project team as a separate team, which is qualified and well engaged in the product and the functionality as such. Also, given the fact with the separation of duties, do you think the finance and the revenue responsibilities should also fall on the project team? Because there are two factors to it.
Yeah.
Or I'll keep it simple. So I'll leave the question this way, open-ended.
No, I get what you mean. So, and correct me if I'm not understanding it correctly, Yuvaraj, but my general sense of your question is, given this is now a financial problem, right? Do we want to get too deeply involved with it as the project team, or do we want to leave it to finance, right? Here is a part of the problem if we leave it to finance. If you do some work for a customer And then that then gets put onto an invoice. And then the client doesn't pay that invoice. The question is why, right? Now, there can be multiple reasons. One is the customer wants to generate some leverage by not paying the invoice, right? That's the way that most customers think, right? If I don't pay the invoice now, I can hold it until I need it to get something that I want, right? But they might also not want to pay it because they actually don't believe that the invoice represents value. So now here becomes the problem with Yuvraj's kind of question. He's not saying that he's suggesting it, but his question was, why not just leave that to finance? When finance gets involved with this, they're going to come and they're going to say to the client, why haven't you paid your invoice? And the client's going to say, because it doesn't represent value. Now, if you guys have already done the project, all right, what's going to happen is finance is going to be talking to who? Probably not to the client. They're going to be talking to the client's procurement division, or accounts payable, sorry, it's who they'll be talking to. And so what ends up happening in this conversation is accounts payable is going to come back and say, well, our people internally said that your services were terrible. And so what they're going to do is they're going to give them a discount, and they are going to then have to identify a concession, which the CFO does not want to do. And then what's going to also happen is your project is going to suffer margin loss, right? So generally what happens is that if you leave or delay this conversation, you're actually hiding whatever the problem is the customer has with your service that you should probably find out now. And typically when customers don't pay invoices, it has something to do with perceived value. So what you want to do is to never, ever allow a client, and I'll say this in big letters here, never allow for a client to have more than one outstanding invoice, right? And what I mean by outstanding is overdue. Sorry, it's probably the wrong word again, right? Outstanding and overdue invoice. And the reason for that is because, one, you don't want them to build up leverage, but secondly,
sorry for interrupting. I think I have a very follow-up question right to this. When the client already has an outstanding invoice, there should have been a remediation which should have already happened before the second invoice comes into play, right? There should have been some resolution which should have happened. Either we understand the value back then, or there should have been something happened and there should have been a course correction which should have happened. We shouldn't go to the late of like 4 or 5 invoices which is pending out there. That's my opinion.
Right, but you don't always control that because of the invoice timing, right? So if you're invoicing monthly and then you have 60-day payment terms, right? What happens is this one is invoiced and it's due in 60 days, but in 30 days, you send another one, which is due in 60 days. So depending on what your terms are, you can actually end up with 3 invoices into the client at one particular point in time. What you need to work on is just the overdue ones, right? So the general idea is address those overdue ones, because what you're going to find is this issue. This issue is something that if you fix it now, can now fix whether or not the customer pays the other invoices. And that's why we don't leave it to finance. Now, if you finish the project and all these invoices are outstanding, then yeah, you're going to leave it to finance, but guess what's going to happen? You're going to end up with margin loss, right? So my general point is don't leave it to finance. As a project team, we care about whether or not the customer is paying our invoices. And the customer paying the invoice is literally them saying, you guys are awesome. I agree that there's value in what you're doing. And if they're not paying their invoices, then we have to find out why. Because why they're not paying the invoice is probably going to tell us what we need to fix. Now, Chase, was it you that had your hand up or somebody else had your hand up before to ask another question?
It was Danny.
Hey, Danny, it was you?
Just on the experience logs, are these supposed to be like recent, or can they be past projects as we go through this course?
So as we go through, we ideally want them to be you trying to do this now, right? We want you to actually take the experience log and go do it on a project that you're on. If for level 1, we have a very lenient kind of like view of them, right? So if you start an experience log that says, you know, hey, last year I had a project and this happened. Look, you're applying the knowledge to a previous experience. you're writing about that experience, which is important. It's actually called cognitive journaling. We think that's a very healthy exercise, so we'll accept it. As we get into levels 2, 3, 4, and 5, we're going to be like, yeah, no. It needs to be from the projects that you're currently on. So does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
But Yuvraj, that whole topic is a great topic. And I know that I've worked in organizations where the project team feels as if they don't want to get involved in the finances. But remember, we're a separate P&L, right? So remember, we are a different business. And so we want to make sure that what we're billing for is of value, because there's more bills to come, right? I mean, you might be if you do a year-long project, there's 12 bills you're going to send this client. And if they're not paying your first one, you want to know why. And essentially what it does is it disarms the client. It allows them to not build up leverage if what they've already done is paid you for the bulk of your work. If you get to the end of the project, you want to make sure that, if you've sent them 12 invoices, you want to make sure that 10 have been paid, right? Because then the total amount of leverage they have over you is 2 invoices. And for most of us, they're actually 2 of the smaller invoices because they're the last 2 on the project when we're doing hypercare. So at the end of the day, we want to reduce the client's leverage to be able to bully us into accepting a lower amount of money. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
It's just the way that it works.
It's kind of a weird question because I've been like part of bigger organizations, and here things have been different because there is clear segregation of duties and things which just comes into play when it comes to revenue and consulting.
Yeah. And that is the hard thing about services is very difficult for that, because it's hard to segregate duties, because finance thinks they own everything that's financial, right? So yeah, okay, that's fine, they do. But professional services is a separate P&L, which means at some point we have to also own our P&L. We have to forecast it. We have to hit it. We have to make margin. We have to do all these things. And finance is built so that it doesn't want to give these things away, right? It doesn't want to give these responsibilities to other groups because nobody else has the finance people. So what basically happens is, as services grows, we either get given finance people from finance to help us run our financial operations, or we have to employ our own, which kind of annoys finance because now they've got financial people and we've got financial people, and we've kind of like created confusion. So usually the organization has to work out as it grows how to get that function done. But we have to have some control over how we invoice. We have to have some control over how we actually recognize revenue. We have to have some control over how we forecast and make money and spend money, right? So that's why it's usually something that the organization just has to work out how it wants to make it happen as it grows up. I've always said, and I'm actually doing a podcast on this soon, is I think the head of services best friend is always finance. Is always the CFO. The CFO and the head of services should be joined at the hip. And the reason for that is because we want the CFO's backing. And we talked about this, I think, previously. We want the CFO's backing when these things escalate. If sales wants to give our money away, well, guess who can stop that from happening? The CFO. If sales wants to keep selling fixed fee deals and it's killing us, guess who can solve that? The CFO. So getting or making friends with the CFO because of the P&L concept that sits within professional services is actually the greatest thing that the head of services can always do. Look at that, 12 o'clock. Guys, thank you so much for your time. You ask great questions. I think we spend the time in a very, very productive way. I don't care about the case study. So if we don't ever want to do the case study again, just keep asking great questions. The more that we ask them, the more that we can get into this stuff. As you probably worked out, I don't have all the answers. All we can do is try and deal with the environment that we've been given and keep trying different things to try and become better and better at what it is that we do. Thank you so much for your time. I'll see you guys again in 2 weeks. We're going to look at principle number 5. We're going to leave the project behind and start focusing on how we extract value from our service. And we'll probably learn more about, in the next one, think fast for quality, how we can actually aim at quality rather than just measure it once it's behind us. Thanks, guys. Have a great 2 weeks, and I'll see you then. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shane.
Cheers.